Hello everyone, I'm Jolima, and in this video I'm going to talk about natural coffee processing. I am going to point out the step-by-step to produce a natural coffee at the farm level, and I am also going to explain to you what are the main characteristics in flavor of a natural coffee process, as well as the advantages and disadvantages for the farmers when producing natural coffees. So to give you a little bit of context, I am a fifth generation coffee producer and my family is still producing coffee in Colombia. So all of the information that I'm going to provide is based on what we have been doing in regards to natural coffees in Colombia. This process might change or vary from country to country, and it's not a process that was originated in Colombia. In Colombia, we mostly process washed coffees. However, because of the different type of profiles that we can achieve with these processing and because of all the variety of flavors that we can find, we have started to process more and more natural coffees in Colombia. It is also better for the environment, and I will explain that a little bit later. To better understand how the natural process works, we need to understand what are the components of the coffee cherry. So I am going to put a little graphic here so that you can see what are the main components on the coffee cherry. As you can see, the coffee cherry has four main components: the skin, which is the red part, the mucilage, which is the honey of the coffee or the sweet part of the coffee, the parchment, and the coffee bean. The first step to produce a really good natural coffee is to pick up the cherries. The cherries should be completely ripe. In our case, we produce a varietal called Castillo Rosario and another varietal called Cenicafe Uno. So for these varietals, when the coffee cherries are ripe, they look like a very dark red, kind of burgundy color, which indicates that they are ready to be picked. However, the case might be different for other varietals, which color can be yellow or orange when it's ripe. Whichever the case might be in regards to the varietal that we're growing, our goal is to pick the cherries when they are super ripe and sweet. In Colombia, this process is done by hand. That means that people go through each tree manually picking each of the ripe cherries, and at the end of the day, they can bring them to the processing facility. After picking and bringing to the processing facility, the coffee cherries need to be sorted so that all of the unripe cherries or cherries that don't look very good are removed. And after this, we go through another classification process that allows us to remove all of the low density beans. We refer to this process as the floating of the cherries. If you saw my previous video about the washed coffee processing, you might have noticed that we remove all of the floaters during the step of washing the coffee beans. However, in this process, in the natural process, we are not going to do any washing of the coffee beans because we are not going to do the pulping, but we still need to remove as many bad cherries as we can. So in order to remove the floaters, we're going to use kind of the same method that we use in the other processing, only that we're going to do it when the cherries are still whole. And we're going to use the same washing facility that we use for the other processing. So what we do is to put all of the coffee cherries into the channel, close the channel and fill it up with water. And then all of the bad cherries or low density beans float to the top. In theory, not all of them, but a lot of them will, and we can remove them. Many of them are gonna look like they are good. They just, in the outside, they look like they are perfect cherries. But in the inside, they are low density, they might be empty, they might be beans that don't have good nutrition, so they didn't develop any density inside, and those we can remove at that stage. Then all of the cherries that stay at the bottom of the channel are considered good quality. There might still be defects in some of those, but we won't know that until the end of the process, because at this stage we have removed all of the defective beans that we can visually identify. After we have classified all of the cherries and make sure we have the best possible coffee cherries to dry, the cherries are packed into burlap bags and put into a shaded place overnight for a period of 12 to 15 hours. This starts the process of fermentation and allows for the coffee to start developing really nice flavors. Normally, the coffee producer will finish the sorting process around 6 p.m. and then will pack the cherries, and the next day around 8 a.m. or so, he will put them in the drying beds. For the drying process, the coffee cherries are put into the drying beds. However, there are some things that we need to keep into account depending on what farm we're processing the coffee in. For example, my parents' farm is located at an elevation of 1900 meters above sea level, which is pretty high. That means that the weather is a little cool and the humidity is very high, and we don't always have a lot of sun. So the drying of a whole coffee cherry can take a long time, 3 even 4 weeks to dry. What we do in order to reduce the time or to protect the coffee cherries from spoiling spoiling is to put it in a very thin layer, if possible a single layer of cherries. This will allow us to dry the cherries a little faster, maybe 3 weeks, and it will reduce the risk of the cherries spoiling. However, in my uncle's farm, which is located at an elevation of 1600 meters above sea level or so, the weather is significantly warmer. Even if you go visit, you can feel that the temperature is warmer, and he can get away with placing the cherries in a layer a little bit thicker. That allows him to dry more cherries at the same time, and also to elongate the process a little bit so that the cherries get all of those fruity flavors during the drying process. My uncle is able to finish the drying process in a period of 12 to 15 days. However, in my parents' farm, the drying process of the whole coffee cherry can take between 20 and 25 days. And during the drying process, it's very important to mix and turn the coffee cherries several times a day to ensure that they are drying evenly and to prevent them from developing any kind of mold or over-fermentation. As mentioned before, we don't want the coffee to dry out too fast if we have a lot of sun, but at the same time, we don't want the process to take way too long, because we will start developing flavors that might not be as pleasant or even over-fermentation in the coffee. Based on our personal experiences, we have realized that the longer the coffee takes to dry, the more fruity that it will be, and the shorter it takes to dry, the less flavorful or fruity it will be. It will taste more and more like a washed coffee than like a natural coffee. Another thing that I have noticed is that the longer that the natural coffee takes to dry, the more yellow or stained the green coffee beans will look. So just by looking at the beans, you are pretty much able to tell how much sugar that coffee will have. That said, I have seen coffee beans that are processed naturally, like for example coffee beans from Ethiopia, that don't look stained at all, but when you roast them, they are super fruity and they have a lot of those blueberry notes to them. So I don't think that it really has anything to do how stained the coffee is, but in our case, it kind of gives us an idea of how much sugar there is in a certain bean. After the coffee is dried in our farms, we packed it in grain pro and burlap bags and let it rest for a few weeks just to kind of even out the moisture levels inside the coffee beans. Same then with the washed coffees, we try to shoot for a moisture level of 11.5% or so for the natural coffees. The next step will be the hulling of the coffee, and this happens right before the export process. Now, at our farms, we are not able to hull the natural coffees as we do with the washed coffees, because our machine won't allow us to do that. So we have to take all of the natural coffees to a dry mill facility in the nearest city where they will be able to hull it for us. And also, they can mechanically remove all of the defective beans that are in the lot that we visually might have a hard time identifying. For the washed coffees, we have people at the village manually picking all of the bad beans. But these coffees, the natural coffees, are so stained that sometimes it can be a little tricky to know whether a coffee is just like that or is defective, because in reality we are not as familiar with natural coffees as we should. And this is just because we are getting started in the process. We have been washing our coffees for several years, and the natural way of processing is pretty new to us. So it's normal that we might have doubts on how the coffee is supposed to look. Actually, a funny story, the first time we processed a natural coffee and my dad saw it, he was very worried about the look of the coffee because it looked all stained. And years ago, if you were to go to the market and sell a coffee that looks like that, it will be considered a defective coffee, and you probably will have to sell it for very cheap. So it is a tough process to change the mentality of the coffee producers to understand that this is okay and that these new processes will allow us to get to better flavors and to start thinking about the flavor of the coffee more so than the look, the physical look of the coffee. I think it's an interesting exercise, but it also takes time just to get used to it. Once the coffee has been hulled and classified by sizes and all of the defects have been removed, the coffee is packed in burlap and grain pro bags, and it is shipped for export. After that, it is imported and finally roasted by wonderful roasters in the US. There are a lot of good things about processing natural coffees. For once, this process is very environmentally friendly. We use a little bit of water at the beginning to remove the floaters, but other than that, we don't use any water, and it's not nearly as much water as we need to use when producing a wash coffee. The natural process can also give us a really unique, complex cup of coffee if done properly. If everything plays on favor of the coffee farmer, if the weather is right, and if he does the process as he's supposed to do it, we can end up with really tasty coffees that can sell for much higher than they will be able to sell a regular wash coffee many times. However, there are also some downsides of producing natural coffee, especially for the farmers. Mainly because usually the farmer is the one taking the majority of the risk when producing a natural coffee. For example, as a coffee producer, it will take you much more time to dry a natural coffee than to dry a wash coffee. Let's say that you own a coffee farm and you have to pay your coffee pickers at the end of the week. At least that's what happens for us and for our partner coffee producers. So if it takes you 3 weeks to dry the natural coffee, that means that you won't see the money until 3 weeks from now when you actually sell the coffee. But you still need to find a way to pay your pickers at the end of each week. So that can be a little challenging unless you're able to get some money in advance from your buyer, or to lend some money, or if your pickers can wait for you a little bit, which usually is not the case because they need the money right away. As a coffee producer, you need to buy supplies weekly, and if you don't get the money quickly, then it makes it a little challenging. The other thing is that the farmer also runs the risk of spoiling the coffee, because this is not a very straightforward process. You don't control the amount of sun, you don't control the weather, and your coffee might end up spoiling if you don't pay close attention. It requires more attention than drying a wash coffee to dry a natural coffee. So there is a big risk there. And at the end of the day, if the coffee doesn't turn out good, the farmer usually is the one that ends up losing everything. That's why we have been trying to collaborate with our farmers and commit to buying the coffee if they follow the step-by-step that we ask them to follow, because it is not really fair to ask a coffee producer to do a process a certain way and then turn our back on them when the process doesn't turn out good. That's not teamwork, and we believe that this is an industry of teamwork. We need to collaborate and work with each other, and sometimes we're going to do well and sometimes we are not. But if we want to grow up together, we need to have each other's back, otherwise we are not going to get anywhere. Now, besides having to wait more time to see the final product, the coffee producer also needs about 3 times more space to dry natural coffee than to dry wash coffee. And at least in our case, that is something hard to achieve. First, our farms are located in mountains that are very steep, so it is not easy to build new raised beds. They are also expensive to build. I have seen pictures of other countries that build temporary raised beds that are long and that can be used during the harvest, but I generally see a lot of people working on those and mixing the coffee, and we don't have a lot of people working at the farm, especially in the drying process. But we have ensured that our raised beds are also covered so that in case it rains, there is no problem. The coffee is not gonna get wet. If we were to build all of these raised beds in the open space and it suddenly rained, we don't have the ability to have people running and covering them all at once, and one person is not gonna be able to do this really easily. It's also a matter of space. Our coffee farms in Colombia, for example, don't have a lot of space to build new raised beds, and the harvest lasts several months, so that means that the coffee producer is constantly bringing coffee into the processing facility that he needs to process, dry, and then sell, so that he can get the money and pay the pickers to keep picking coffee, and so on and so forth. So if you bring coffee every day and it takes you 3 weeks to take it out, eventually you're gonna run out of space unless you have the infrastructure to process the coffee and have it there for as long as you want. That's not our case. Building more raised beds will mean that we have to cut down some trees to make space, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Natural processed coffees can be very flavorful and unique. This processing method also allows for notes that are more difficult to find in wash coffees. Other countries have mastered the technique and we are still working on it, but we have seen really nice results. And as a country, Colombia has coffee farms that are doing incredible stuff with natural coffee processing. We are trying to learn as much as we can, and we have come up with really nice coffees so far. Thank you very much for watching this video. I really hope that you learned something new. If you did, please leave me a comment below, or if you have any questions or comments, please comment below as well, and I will make sure to get back to you. I would love to keep creating coffee related content for you. Please let me know if there is anything that you would like me to talk about. If you want to support my channel, please subscribe, and I will see you next time. Adios!